Good evening and welcome. Good evening and welcome. I'm Roger Hertog, co-chair of tonight's dinner, and I thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to welcome you to what you can see as a sold-out event. Just look around. There's not an empty seat in the house. If you spent any time in your life co-chairing an event of this type, you know it brings new meaning to the thought, no good deed goes unpunished. But this dinner has been different, and the result has been, because of you, a resounding success. We've received much great support from many executive committee members in putting this evening together, and first among equals is our own General George Patton, Merrill Hyatt Tisch. Merrill has been a co-chairman, partner, and to use a French phrase, a mensch. She's been involved in every aspect of planning for this event and has really done a great job. The second, so to say, heavy lifter is Executive Committee member Marty Gross. Marty really rose to the occasion. He's introduced many new people to our institute. We owe him our debt of gratitude. And finally, there is the chairman of the executive committee, Fred Lafer, who once again was an important contributor. So let me ask all three of them to stand and accept our recognition for their heroic efforts. Please. But truth be told, there's another reason for the turnout and why it's been so successful. And it's the individuals we're honoring this evening. Dr. Bernard Lewis and the Honorable George P. Shultz. Any dinner chairman, thank you. Any dinner chairman would be blessed with having either of them featured on his or her program. And we're doubly blessed this evening. If that wasn't enough, Dayenu, our two rock star honorees, have enabled us to raise an incredible $1.4 million. Thank you. So how will we go about using this money? As I'm sure you know, the purpose of the Washington Institute is to analyze, to research all aspects of the Middle East and its relationship with the United States. Those of us who support the Institute are engaged in what I call strategic philanthropy, the search for a deeper understanding of the ideas involved and the more effective pathways towards their resolution. If you had to define a single concept underlying everything the Institute does, it's the concept that ideas have consequences. Indeed, I'd say only ideas have consequences that are large and long-lasting. If you're winning the war of ideas, all the rest will follow. But there are many fronts on the war of ideas. Some are in our own backyard, and some are quite dangerous. Think for a moment about the recent bestseller, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, written by two recognized academics and published by one of the leading firms in the world, Farrar Straus. The unmistakable message of this book is that 9/11 was caused in significant measure by American Jewry. The United States has a terrorism problem, the book states, in good part because it has long been so supportive of Israel. Support, it argues, has essentially been forced on America by the Israel lobby. In fact, the Washington Institute and its scholars are cited 28 times as card-carrying members of the Israel lobby. But the battlefront is far broader than homegrown issues like that one. It is in those arenas where America and the West face the greatest threats, bear the greatest burdens, that the Washington Institute makes its most indispensable contribution. What to do about Iraq? What to do about nuclear proliferation, especially involving Iran? Questions surrounding the Arab-Israeli conflict. The influence of radical Islam on Hezbollah and Hamas. Deadly, serious issues. Every single one. All these ideas, all of these questions are relevant to an occasion like this that honors character and excellence in scholarship and statesmanship. This is what the Washington Institute is all about. This is why this dinner is so significant. Because if you care about ideas and you care about the factors that will influence the U.S. and the Middle East, you have to be fighting in the war of ideas. Our goal for this evening is that every one of us should walk away having learned something new about the issues we face as a nation. What I'd like to do now is have you focus, I promised for a few short minutes, on a video. Someone once said, "Tell me and I will forget. Show me and I may remember. But involve me and I'll understand." We want you involved in the Washington Institute. But the only way you can be involved is if we tell you and first show you. As I said before, our goal for the evening is that every one of us in some way or another should walk away having learned something new or having thought about something in a different way about the issues that we face as a nation, about the issues that we face as a world. Our means to that end will be a conversation with Dr. Bernard Lewis and the Honorable Secretary George Shultz. It's to be moderated by the Institute's extraordinary leader. He looks young. He isn't this young, so when he comes up, don't think he's this young. But he has been the executive director over the last 14 years, and his name is Rob Satloff, and he's someone we are all really proud of and we learn from. And so, Rob, I am honored to turn over the program to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. As someone who's about to have another baby, I feel young, even if I'm not young. If I can just for a moment, I would like to express my gratitude and my admiration for the evening's chairs, Merrill Tisch and Roger Hertog. You both have been extraordinary. Truly extraordinary in putting together this fantastic event. If I may also just pay a word of honor and homage, first to Mike Stein, who is the chairman emeritus of the Institute and one of our founders and leaders And then secondly, to Mike's partner in helping to found the Institute, Barbie Weinberg, who arrived in New York this morning and then had to turn around because she had to fly back for a funeral right after arriving in this town. So we bid her all Godspeed. And then the last of my introductions is merely to note that at many of your tables, you are joined by my colleagues, the scholars of the Washington Institute. And it is with great pride that I ask all of them just to rise to be acknowledged by everyone here this evening. Tonight, we are honoring the idea that ideas matter. The idea that ideas have consequences. And we are honoring two people who, through their lives, their professional achievements, and their accomplishments, have done so much to advance our nation's understanding of the Middle East, our nation's interests in the Middle East. I would like first to call upon a man who himself is a scholar-statesman, our nation's permanent representative to the United Nations, former ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan, a former participant in Washington Institute study groups abroad, a friend of long standing, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad.
Thank you, Rob. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce former Secretary of State George Shultz. I thank the Washington Institute for honoring one of America's great statesmen. Secretary Shultz is a former ultimate boss of mine at the Department of State. Mr. Secretary, I don't know where you are.
Right there, in the middle, on the left.
It's great to see you, sir. Between 1986 and 1988, I had the privilege of serving on his policy planning staff and as a special advisor to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. My role was to advise on policy towards the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the Iran-Iraq war. As Rob said, having recently served in Kabul and Baghdad, and as I work daily on issues related to Iran, I am living the adage, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Secretary Shultz is now at Stanford University. I have a son there studying law, where he is the Thomas W. and Susan B. Ford Distinguished Fellow at Hoover Institution. I remember when he was Secretary of State, he used to tell a story about how the leaders of Stanford tried to entice him to come to the university. They said they would have a chair ready and waiting for him. He replied that after what he had been doing as secretary, he would need a couch, not a chair. Mr. Secretary, I expect that your colleagues have made you comfortable in Palo Alto. More seriously, we are privileged to honor a man who has many great attributes. I want to highlight three that enable him to play a pivotal role. First, Secretary Shultz has a deep understanding and timely recognition of the forces, such as globalization, shaping contemporary history. During the 1980s, We saw the globalization of economic activity through trade, investment, and production that were creating unprecedented opportunities to increase the well-being of the developed and developing worlds through an enhanced international division of labor based on comparative advantage. He resisted calls for protectionism, quite powerful at the time, and helped Deng Xiaoping's China open itself to the world. Also, he saw that in a number of developing countries, the increase in the middle class, the rise of political aspirations and belief in individual rights, and the information revolution were setting the stage for the third wave of democratization. He supported the transition to democracy in the Philippines and throughout Latin America, the forerunners of the color revolutions. Second, Secretary Shultz focuses on big issues and advocates appropriately big ideas, and has the courage to challenge conventional wisdom, and is persistent. Some of his friends have said even stubbornly so. He worked with President Reagan to advance the vision of a world not bound by the suicide pact of mutual assured destruction, and ultimately of a world free of nuclear weapons. At the time, the conventional wisdom was dismissive. However, President Reagan and Secretary Shultz believed in this big idea and pursued it. Their efforts eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, intermediate-range systems, and shifted the focus of arms control talks to actual reduction of these weapons, setting the stage for the dramatic build-down in US and Russian nuclear forces. President Reagan's advocacy in building defenses against ballistic missiles was part of this effort. This, too, was controversial. I remember a meeting that the Secretary hosted at which he brought together all the previous heads of policy planning. It seemed that all of them used their time to beat up on Ronald Reagan and on the Secretary for the Strategic Defense Initiative. They said it wouldn't work, was heightening tensions, and would backfire. One even said that we had a better chance of teaching a horse to fly than missile defense. Secretary Shultz replied, "You work on getting horses to fly, and I will work on missile defense. Let's see who does better." We should note that our ballistic missile defense system now has an operational capability, while there is still no sign of flying horses. And the Secretary's belief that we can achieve a more secure world without nuclear weapons is not just a thing of the past. Just recently, he co-authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, along with Henry Kissinger and other leading foreign policy thinkers, that called for renewed efforts to achieve a nuclear-free world and deal with the emerging nuclear threat, such as the Iranian program. Third, Secretary Shultz understands how the combination of a clear vision and a patient and persistent use of diplomacy can profoundly change the world. As early as in 1979, Secretary Shultz saw how the endgame of the Cold War would unfold. In a speech at Stanford University, he said, and I quote, "The Soviet system is incompetent and cannot survive," end of quote. When President Gorbachev and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze took power in 1985, President Reagan and Secretary Shultz pivoted American policy. They pressed the new Soviet leaders geopolitically while engaging them about the need to change their own system or risk hopelessly falling behind. It was this strategy that encouraged Gorbachev to pursue perestroika, and ultimately that resulted in the end of the Cold War. We continue to benefit from Secretary Shultz's insights into our current challenges and opportunities. He has said recently that the present era is a kind of golden moment in the world. that is unparalleled in its promise. As economies all over the world are expanding and poverty is being reduced dramatically in some countries, creating a necessary condition for political openness. The Secretary also said there are forces in the Islamic world who want to bring about changes which can destroy this golden moment. Therefore, the issue of the crisis of the Islamic civilization is an issue for the entire world. The Secretary has been an advocate of the U.S. leading the world in confronting the challenges of extremism and terror. Secretary Shultz is fond of saying that a good statesman is like a good gardener, patiently pulling the weeds that crop up while also tending and encouraging the good plants to flourish. Today, there is much good in the world to encourage, as well as bad elements that need weeding. Mr. Secretary, please join us up here. It's my honor to introduce Secretary Shultz.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We are privileged tonight to have another scholar statesman here with us, and it is my honor to introduce the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, the former president of Tel Aviv University, another longtime friend of the Washington Institute, Professor Itamar Rabinovich.
Good evening. I want to congratulate the Washington Institute for its work day in and day out and on a very successful event tonight. I want to thank the Washington Institute for giving me the privilege of participating in the tribute paid to two great men, particularly the privilege of introducing my mentor and friend, Professor Bernard Lewis. I was never a student formally of Professor Lewis, but he's been my teacher and mentor for more than 30 years now directly, and has had a great influence on many of us who has studied the Middle East, have written on the Middle East, and sometimes have also translated the research and knowledge into the pursuit of policies. I want to begin my introduction of Professor Lewis around 1970. This was a crucial period in the Middle East, 3 years after the Six-Day War, the war of attrition between Egypt and Syria and Israel, the height of Soviet influence in the Middle East. An American response to that Soviet advance was the Rogers Plan, a notion that if the United States forced Israel to give back the territories captured in 1967, a better period would come. To help disabuse Washington of the idea that territories should be given for basically nothing, the late Senator Henry Jackson invited a great scholar of the Middle East, a great historian of the Middle East, who was transitioning from London to Princeton at the time, Professor Lewis. And I invite all of you to find the pages in the records of the U.S. Committee, the Senate Committee on International Relations, to see what happens when a great historian applies his knowledge and his understanding and his perspective to current events. Professor Lewis then completed the move from London to Princeton and has had a profound impact on U.S. policy in the Middle East from Princeton and in Washington. Let me now go back to around 1939, 1940. seminal period in Bernard Lewis's evolution. World War II breaks out. He's a young PhD in Islamic studies from the University of London. He is drafted to the forces of His Majesty's service, and soon enough they know exactly where to place him in order to maximize his talents. And he spent several years in what he likes to call His Majesty's service. The British are very good in keeping the Official Secrets Act, but that period was seminal in bringing him to the realities of the world that protected him from becoming a detached academic historian. In 1940, 67 years ago, his doctoral dissertations on the origins of the Ismailis, an Islamic sect, was published. So when Professor Lewis looks at the Middle East with perspective, he does it in two ways. The perspective of a great historian who commands the subject matter, but also from a personal perspective, somebody whose own life experience and scholarship provide him with a perspective that few have. Think about the knowledge. Professor Lewis is in command of 4 civilizations: classic civilization, European, Western civilization, Islamic civilization, and Jewish civilization. He knows the languages, he knows the literature. And when I say Islamic, he knows the Arab side of the dimension of Islamic culture and history, the Turkish and the Persian, the languages and the literature. They don't make them like that anymore, but this is the extent of the scholarship. Now, you could say that he is an Orientalist, that he is a Middle East expert, that he is a historian of Islam. There could be many titles, but he is first and foremost a historian. I mentioned The Origins of the Ismailis as the first book. The book that made him famous was written after World War II, and it's called The Arabs in History. Mind you, not the history of the Arabs, but the Arabs in history. It's a short, wise insight into the place of the Arabs in history and the interplay between the Arab nation, culture, civilization, language, and the passage of time that is history. And then followed many, many other books, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, which is still the best, the classic study about the evolution, the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish state. The Middle East and the West, one of the major themes pursued by Professor Lewis, who understands Islamic history and the modern history of the Middle East as an ongoing, say, confrontation between the Middle East and the West. Sometimes the Middle East or Islam having the upper hand, invading Europe, conquering Spain, parts of France, and later on the Ottomans going all the way to the gates of Vienna. And in the last 2 centuries plus, it is the West that has come to the Middle East, and it's been the Middle East that has not been able to come to grips with the West and modernity, the central theme of the region's history. Dozens of books, hundreds of articles. The scholarly production is amazing, and yet Bernard Lewis has remained with his feet planted in reality, a friend and advisor to presidents, foreign secretaries, prime ministers, other scholars, with a huge influence on generations of scholars, students, policymakers. He is an objective scholar to the extent that scholarship can be objective, but he knows who he is and he knows who his friends are. He is loyal to individuals, to entities, to countries. He is unabashedly a friend of Israel and Turkey. He has been a friend in good times and in bad times. He's a good friend and a loyal friend to individuals, and someone who fell from power and grace in Washington not so long ago knows that Bernard is a good friend in rainy days as well, even when the winds are not very friendly to the men and to those who stand by him. He's very eloquent, as you will hear in speech tonight and in writing. If you ever read, and if you haven't, I encourage you to rush and buy and read. One of the world's most eloquent, elegant men who brought a great tradition of British style and wit to his writing and to his speeches. The wit and the elegance are trademarks. Let me share a couple of stories with you. In the 1950s, I think the Secretary of State and Ambassador Khalilzad would appreciate it, political appointments in the State Department. A Republican donor was nominated ambassador to Sri Lanka, today, to Ceylon, today Sri Lanka. He came to testify to be confirmed before the Senate committee, and one of the members said, "Can you name the Prime Minister of Ceylon," who was Solomon Bandaranaike, a very difficult name. The would-be ambassador did not know the name, certainly could not recite it. There was a great embarrassment. Professor Lewis was visiting the United States. He was interviewed, and the journalist said, "Well, Professor Lewis, you come from a country with a great imperial tradition. What can you say about our system of appointing ambassadors?" And he said, "You know, I don't like to meddle in the affairs of a country I visit. All I can say is that some of your ministers are plenipotentiary and some of your ambassadors are extraordinary." Another typical Bernard Lewis story from the law. He was once speaking at an American university about Islam, and an angry student from the Middle East stood up at the end of the lecture and said, "Professor Lewis, how can you speak about Islam? You're not a Muslim. You have not lived the Islamic experience from within." And Professor Lewis smiled wryly and said, "By extension of your logic, sir, only fish could teach marine biology in this university." Oh. So there is the witty, elegant side that makes this awesome scholarship bearable. So I've enjoyed, Professor Lewis has been coming, Harvey Kruger will forgive me, to Tel Aviv University every single year since 1972. I heard him for the first time when I was an undergraduate at the Hebrew University, and he still goes to the Hebrew University, but he comes every year, let's say, to Israel. He stayed in Israel during the first Gulf War. You know, somebody who went through the Blitz could take Saddam's missiles with a smile. And he's a wonderful friend to have for a person, for an institution. We are all lucky as his friends, readers, and disciples that he's made this contribution. And I think that you Americans are lucky that the understanding of the Middle East in this country is enriched by Bernard Lewis's insights. Finally, a small tribute of our own, small in comparison to tonight's tribute. In December, a book is going to be published called Israel in the Middle East. It's a college reader edited by the president of Brandeis, Yehuda Reinhartz, and myself, and we proudly dedicate the book to Bernard Lewis. Thank you.